Two wars are ongoing. They both seem to have a similar flavor. Bureaucracies behaving badly, as the product of decisions that their respective leaders had made before the conflicts began. But sometimes the world of geopolitics is not as clear as it seems from the outside. So pick up the phone as we try to get to the bottom of things on today's edition of the Geopolitics Helpline. Some geopolitical experts lambast the Trump administration for firing career bureaucrats. We also see the Trump administration take some action that just seems incompetent, like not informing Italy in advance of airbase use. How does incompetence factor into crisis bargaining theory? Does firing career bureaucrats not affect the ability of an actor to see and calculate their options? Funny story, I had put this viewer's question into my queue, and then after I started writing my answer, the viewer posted it again, this time with a $5 bribe. So thank you for that, especially as it ended up being unnecessary. Or, as another viewer said, it is not a bribe if you get money to do something that you already want to do. It is a donation from a lobbyist. Anyway, I promise you that I will get to wars and explosions in a minute, but first let me describe the general issue. A recurring problem across politics is the trade-off between ideological outcomes and what are called valence issues. To use a domestic politics example, there is substantial disagreement between the left and the right over total taxation and how to divide the burden sharing over income levels. Those are ideological issues. But no one wants a tax bureaucracy that needs 10% of the revenues to operate, when an alternative tax bureaucracy could accomplish the same task for 1% of the revenues. That is a valence issue. Now, in an ideal world, there would be no trade-off between ideology and valence. For example, as a liberal president, I would just implement progressive tax reforms, and I would ensure that the IRS is full of competent bureaucrats who can efficiently run the system. The problem is that life is not always so simple. In the Senate, for example, you only have 100 people to staff 16 regular committees, plus a handful of special and joint committees with the House. As a party head, it would be tempting to try to limit staffing of those committees to only those with extremely close ideological positioning to me. But that is just not practical given the work that needs to be done. So, instead, you get committee assignments partially based on who would just be better fit for that particular role. Senators from rural states to handle farming committees, and senators with military experience to handle veterans affairs. They may not produce the exact policies that you will like, but they will do better on the valence portions of those policies. Zooming out, how you handle the fundamental trade-off depends on how polarized the preferences are of the actors. The deeper the polarization is, the less inclined you are to delegate a task to a high-valence individual. You can see how stark the problem is inside of autocracies. We normally do not think about authoritarian loyalty as ideological polarization, but that is effectively what it is. In Russia, for example, you have Putin not surprisingly being on the really pro-Putin side of the aisle. Then you have various others moving along the spectrum going the other way, where some may actually be personally fond of the Russian president, while others fall into their positions based on how willing they are to harm the common good in advancement of their own careers. In autocracies, you tend to get strong feelings one way or another here. Moreover, the autocrat views the difference in policy outcomes on this dimension as significant. A government run by the anti-Putin cohort might ensure that Putin is done. And I mean that not in the political way, but rather the corporal way. Consequently, promotion decisions in autocracies tend to be less determined by valence production, and more by matching ideological preference, or what you colloquially but nebulously might call loyalty. Hence you have one of the main drivers of the well-documented problems that Russia had at the start of the war. When agreement with the leader is the key criteria for holding high-level positions, you tend to get low-level quality. Now, in democracies, it tends to be better. Emphasis on tends to. Actually, things were quite bad in the United States before Mr. Death by Lightning himself, James Garfield, began implementing reforms to do away with the spoil system within the American bureaucracy. Fast forward more than a century, and the United States is undergoing its largest bureaucratic shuffling in most of our lifetimes. The Trump administration's appointments appear to emphasize ideology over valence, never mind the gutting of positions where the president has firing authority. That said, I think it is important to be clear about where this has and has not caused problems. The gutting of USAID? Absolutely problematic for trying to use aid as a political lever, as the United States has, or had done for decades. Note, though, that many advocates for Trump's move here would describe this as a feature, not a bug. Steve Witkoff, lead negotiator in various forms. His ignorance of the actual international negotiating process and his ignorance of how to structure said agreements is well known. How much this is adding to real international problems versus having everyone just spin their wheels for months on end is unclear. In contrast, the prevailing narratives ascribe too much of the problems in Iran to bureaucratic shuffles. Yes, there has been plenty of churn in the Pentagon, but the roster of competent bureaucrats runs deep enough over there that things do not just fall apart when Trump makes some high-profile moves. There is this bizarre narrative from the left that Trump had no idea what could happen in Iran, that Netanyahu spoon-fed him what he wanted to hear to get him to go along with the war effort, and that he did not consult anyone else in the government who had the knowledge and ability to say otherwise. The problem is that basically all of that narrative is false, with documented reporting from liberal media outlets that say otherwise. Yes, Netanyahu had that meeting, but plenty in the Trump administration tried to warn him of the dangers, and they failed. Trump pursued a very risky policy that, as of yet, has not borne any real fruit. I do not understand why the left continues with that narrative, when I think that what I described is worse. There was an actively bad call made here, rather than a mistake due to ignorance. I suppose that this version has more nuance, but I think that bearing the cost of that nuance is worth it for the sake of accuracy. Anyway, the original question asked about how an ineffective bureaucracy alters crisis bargaining, so let me end with a few pithy points on that subject. First, the expected outcome and costs of war do not descend from heaven as some sort of inexorable truth. A well-trained military, with good intelligence, and armed with state-of-the-art weapons, is more likely to win and suffer fewer costs in the process. Well, a bureaucracy plagued by patronage appointments will struggle on those fronts. But note that the first-order effect here does not mean more war. It just means worse negotiated settlements for the state. How poor intelligence affects things is trickier. There is a temptation here to say that it leads to more war, citing Russia as a primary example, and maybe Iran too, despite the aforementioned flaws in that argument. Well, you might remember from past videos that it is not so simple. Miscalculation works both ways. Strong intelligence can rationally inspire ultimately inaccurate confidence that aggressive demands will work out, because even good intelligence sometimes gets the wrong signals. Weak intelligence can fail to inform countries that they could have gotten away with more aggressive demands as well. The key point here is that poor bureaucratic capacity hurts the country in question, but tells us surprisingly little about whether it causes more war. We just hear about cases like Russia because wars get much more attention. When bad intelligence causes a country to lower its demands, the situation fades into a historical black hole because no one pays attention to it afterward. Ironically, it is those who cannot say anything who capture greater focus. Meanwhile, you could keep paying attention to me after today's video. All you have to do is click here to view the ever-growing Geopolitics Helpline archive. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you tomorrow. Take care.